Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the What's New in Prism 1.7 webinar. Doug Novy, our QA Engineer 3, will be walking you through the new updates and features and our latest release of our Prism DAS software. Alrighty, Doug, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, I'm Douglas Novy. I'm a QA engineer here at ESC Spectrum. For those who don't know what a QA engineer is, my goal is to try to break the software, so I'm always looking for problems. That being said, I'm going to do my best to talk about the good stuff, not how I have to see the product in general. Anywho. But first, I wanted to make some announcements about future platform support. So this doesn't necessarily pertain to Prism 1.7, which is what this webinar is really about, but going forward. So starting with Prism 1.8, which is not this release, the next one, it's scheduled this summer, late July, early August 2023. We're ESC Spectrum. We're trying to make the platform support consistent across all of our software products. And when I say platform support, I'm talking about the .NET framework, your Windows Server operating system, your Windows Client operating system, and then SQL Server. So first, with Windows version support for Prism 1.7, the release we're talking about today and earlier, we will continue to support old platforms such as the Windows 10 client until the end of 2023. But looking forward, here's a timeline of the Windows Server platform and the associated SQL Server, kind of like what we're looking at going forward. So as you can see, SQL Server 2016 SP3 with Windows Server 2016. We're going to end support for that at the end of 2023. But for Windows with SQL Server 2017 to 2019, we have not yet determined an end date for that, and the same with Windows Server 2022 and SQL Server 2019. So on the client side, where you actually install the Prism main application and you interact with it and all that, we currently, as I mentioned, the other version of Windows, we're going to continue to support through the end of 2023. And as of right now, we also support Windows 10 and Windows 11 for the client, and we have not determined an end date for those. Now, regarding the .NET framework, starting with Prism 1.8, any computers or servers running the Prism application, including both Prism Server and Prism clients, will be required to have the new Microsoft .NET Framework 4.8 installed. So if you're not sure what that means or all that, just contact your IT department and they can verify for you that .NET 4.8 runtime has been installed. And on your client machine, the thing, if you've been keeping up with the regular Windows updates for Windows 10, the May 2019 update should have done this for you already. Now, some of you probably heard that the EPA is changing up the way that we do the ECMPS submissions. It's called ECMPS 2.0. Rather than using XML format, we're using JSON. Anyway, Prism 1.8, we're planning to include a preview feature that will meet the ECMPS 2.0 requirements. And if you're not familiar, Prism offers preview features, which is, it's kind of like you can just turn on a setting and you can see some of the beta features that we want to get out there, but they're not quite ready for full prime time, but we want to get them out there and people can try them. So Prism 1.8, we will include a preview feature which will allow you to submit to ECMPS 2.0 during the EPA's trial period for that. As I mentioned, we're planning on releasing that at the end of July, beginning of August 2023. Now for Prism 1.9, we're going to release the full feature to support Prism ECMPS 2.0. And normally we would release Prism 1.9 in February 2024, but the EPA may come out and say, hey, the ECMPS 2.0 trial period went really well, so we're going to require everybody to submit using ECMPS 2.0 by January 2024. So if that happens, we can't wait till February to release 1.9. So in such a case, we would do a special release of Prism 1.9 that December of 2023 to support that going forward. Now, so in summary, ECMPS 2.0 might be required. That this is out of our hands. ECMPS 2.0 might be required for submittal by January 2024. Prism 1.9 will be required for you to meet that requirement of ECMPS 2.0. And .NET 4.8 will be required to support Prism 1.9, and Windows Server 2016 and SQL Server 2016 SP3 will not be supported by 1.9. So too long didn't read. Plan to upgrade by the end of 2023. That's what this really comes down to. Okay, now on to the features. QA test deadlines. Forgive me if I did a lot of, we introduced a lot of good new features, created a lot of new user interfaces for people so you can edit the Prism configurations without needing to go into the SQL database. And then we also had lots of bugs fixed. So this is the things I'm presenting today is actually a subset of what we really did. I had to go through and edit down this presentation quite a bit and get rid of a lot of things. So I'm just trying to show you the stuff I thought would be most interesting. Anyway, QA test deadlines report modules edition. We added a new report to the reports modules that supports QA test deadlines. These are some of the things that were included in it. And just like all the other reports, you load the QA test deadlines and these are the input options and you hit view report. Right. Server installer, look up the number of data collector instances for existing systems. So the point behind this is that if you're doing a fresh install, you don't have Prism server installed at all, you run the installer, you have to tell it how many data collectors you want. But if you're running an upgrade, like you already have Prism 1.6 and you're trying to get to Prism 1.7, when you run the Prism server installer, before you had to actually know how many data collectors you wanted when you ran the installer. But now when you run the installer, if it's on top of an existing database, i.e. an upgrade, the installer will look into the database and figure out how many DCSs you need, and it will install them accordingly. Startup session editor and admin screen redesign. So if you're not familiar, the startup sessions, that's that SView file that you can launch into the main application. Well, we improved the way that those get created. We created a better user interface for creating and editing those. And we added some of the information that was missing. So if you navigated to it through the admin menu, you'd see something like this. And it gives you the options to create new ones, which is kind of starting from scratch, or you can create from current. So whatever settings you have set up, and that's what you're using to view the main application, you can create a new SView file based off of that. And this is what the wizard would look like when you do the, create from. Okay, and raw point configuration. Administrative interface for configuring raw points. So this is another user interface that was added so that you don't have to go into the database to do the thing. So in other words, this provides the ability to configure analog and digital data points for a given source. Previously, like I mentioned, you had to go into the database and do all this. So how do you get to it? Well, you navigate through your admin menu and you find your source of interest, and you'll see this new icon, the 3 dots that are branched like that. And when you select that, it'll launch into the raw point configuration editor, and you have the option of configuring your digital inputs, outputs, and analog inputs and outputs. And there's some, filtering options, sorting, all that. You can see which tag is associated with your raw point. And so if you were in edit mode, you could go ahead and add a new raw point, and it'll walk you through this wizard where, depending on the kind of point you're adding, you have the base address, the write address, and all the scaling stuff that you would normally have to go to the database to configure. Now, let's say you already had a raw point in there. You could go ahead and select it, and you could edit an existing raw point and change this information. Note that it's showing you the associated tags. Maybe there's an associated calibration sequence. It kind of gives you all that context information for the thing that you're messing with. All right, site viewer, no longer a preview feature. As I mentioned before, we have this concept of preview features where you can sort of see the beta version of something. We just want to get it out there so people can start playing with it, but we hide it behind this preview feature option just so, previously we introduced this thing that is, it's a way to view your entire site, all the relationships between tags and calibrations and qualification parameters. It's a hierarchy view, a tree view to display all these relationships. And it was introduced previously as a preview feature. It was pretty good. We were pretty confident in how it was working. So we went ahead and rolled it into a full feature. But you'll see something like this when you navigate to it. You can see, for example, reporting group, and then you have probe, instrument tag, so on and so forth. So if you haven't used this feature, I really recommend it. It's a great sort of way to just see your system as a whole and see how things are related to each other. You can do some of the advanced filtering that you see elsewhere in the product. All right, site viewer. Again, because we were pulling it out of preview feature, we wanted to add to it, make it a little bit better. So we introduced more information. So now you can also see more information about if it's a tag, a bottle, a source, QA event config, alarm. So for example, if you selected this tag from the site view, you would see all this associated information. It's a calculation. These are the tags that are dependent on this tag. Say for bottles, sources, QA events, alarms. Okay. Application configuration, another administrative screen addition. So as I was mentioned before, you'd have to go to the database to do this, but now we have a user interface for this. So basically, this is the thing that you would use to configure your services, like your alarm service, your data collector service. You can see the endpoints, kind of what versions they're at. Maybe you have some email addresses associated with your alarm service. You can go into there and edit all these things now without going into the database. Okay. Sources administration. Improved adding and editing sources. Basically, we revamped the sources dialog wizard when you go to add a new source. Improved a lot of the validation stuff. In other words, we wanted the UI to not let you put in bad information. Before, if you typed in some bogus numbers or characters or whatever, it would just let you, and you'd end up with problems that you would have to then fix. So now the wizard won't let you do that. So if you got to the source editor, you could hit add new source, and you would get walked through a wizard like this. It'll look a little bit different depending on the source type that you're doing, because the downstream options are dependent on the source type that you pick. And as part of this, there was some bugs that were fixed. There was some issue where some unsafe changes could cause a client crash. And since we were in here anyway, messing around, we wanted to allow the 8864 sources to also support IPv6 addresses. It's not something you see very often, but we were there, so we wanted to add it. All right, add option to override the analog number for 8864 point configuration. So for a little bit of background on this, for analog inputs on the 8864, we use what's called an A-type channel. It's a standard averaging channel. And the convention that we always use, the standard practice is that channel number 10, for example, in the logger, would always be associated with analog input point number 10. And when I say analog input point 10, what I mean is like that's the actual spot in the back of the logger you plugged those 4 to 20 milliamp wires into. So that's the convention. The channel number and the analog input number always match up. However, what you'll see in practice though is maybe that spot number 10, I don't know, it got damaged, hit by lightning, whatever. That spot number 10 stops working at some point. And the technician in the field wants to just move those wires to the next available one, like maybe spot number 15. But you don't want to have to go in and change your entire configuration to also then move that channel to that spot 15, because there could be a lot of downstream constituents that then also have to be messed with. So what we did was we allowed for an override where a user could, rather than using that standard convention where the channel number and the analog number match up, you could select override and put in the analog input channel, the analog input number that you want to use instead. So for example, if you went through the wizard to make a new point here, you would see that by default, it is unchecked, which means that the channel number and the analog input number are the same. But you could go ahead and check the box, and then here you'll see that my channel number was channel 1, but my analog input number, the actual spot where those 4 to 20 milliamp wires go into, that got changed to the second location. All right, 8864, cold start. Added a button to cold start and configure an 8864. And again, this one is a preview feature. This is the first time we're introducing it. So if you wanted to access this, you'd have to make sure to turn that on. But what does it do? It's a single button click that will cold start your 8864, which if you're not familiar, a cold start is when the logger wipes out all of its data and all of its configuration, and it reboots and it comes back online. So think of it as a factory reset for all of the configuration and data. All of the hardware configuration, like your card counts and your IP address and kind of the hardware configuration side remains untouched, but all the configuration and data gets wiped. Now, this feature will not only cold start it, but once it comes back online, it will reprogram the 8864 to set all the analog inputs, the analog outputs, the digital inputs, the digital outputs with the associated Modbus channels. It will send the Modbus server.cfg file, and it will also send the calibration sequences. In other words, it's an easy button. You hit it, it clears your logger and it rebuilds it, and it should be ready to work after that. So how do you do it? Well, turn on preview features, and then you navigate to the source configuration, and you'll see that little cold start button. So just to kind of show how quick and easy this is, you turn on preview features, and then I'm just going to go ahead and navigate to source configuration, select my data logger source, make sure I go to edit mode, and you see that icon, the little circle for cold start, and I hit that. Now we put this very strict confirmation dialog here where you have to literally type confirm in capital letters to make this happen. And that's because this isn't something you want to do by accident. And so you'll see just lost communication with the 8864, which is expected because it's rebooting. There's a little message in the day log that we're doing the cold start. And so now Prism is monitoring looking for the 8864 to wait for it to come back online. But in the meantime, you see it loses data connection, right? And once it comes back online, Prism starts sending the commands to reprogram it. And so you'll see here, I was able to log in to the day logger, and it's already starting to rebuild all of the channels, all the digital points and everything. So pretty cool feature. If you have a logger that needs to be reprogrammed, I recommend checking it out. Anyway, bottle manager, better notes on expiring or expired bottles. So there was a customer request to see an indication on the bottle manager screen for a bottle that is close to expiring or expired. And this is for active bottles in the inventory. And so we offer two different UI elements to indicate this. There's the yellow warning triangle, which means that it's within 30 days of expiration. And then there's the red triangle, which means it's expired. So you'll see something like this, the little red one, and you can hover over it, by the way, and you can see the actual expiration date while you hover over those icons. All right, and along the same lines, there was a request made to ensure that users are sufficiently notified regarding expired or nearly expired bottles when you're adding a bottle to inventory or putting a bottle in service. And so what you'll see is if something is expired, this is for the bottle swap. If something's expired, it'll say, hey, this bottle expired on such and such date. Do you want to keep going or do you want to retire? And the same with the warning. And in a similar sense, if you have the same kind of confirmations when you're adding a new bottle, right? And some more bottle manager stuff. We allow bottle swap for bottles with varying components. So it used to be that if you wanted to swap bottles, but the components weren't 100% matching, it wouldn't let you do it. So for example, bottle A has component A, B, and C. Bottle C, the other bottle has an additional component, and it didn't quite jive, so it wouldn't let you do it. So now it'll let you do it. And also, if the bottle you're trying to swap in is missing a component that was expected, it'll just use a default concentration level of 0. So for example, you try to swap out the bottle, it says, hey, the number of components in the new bottle do not match the components in the old bottle. And so when replacing with non-matching components, the user will see this warning screen indicating to them the concentrations and making sure that they're okay with continuing. All right, new admin user interface redesign for the non-bottle expected values. And if you're not familiar, non-bottle expected values are the things that, they're expected values for calibration sequences that aren't tied to gas bottles. So for example, opacity, right? You don't run gas to measure opacity. You just know that it should be 15%, things like that. So now this is what the user interface looks like. You can see the reporting group in the top left, and you can do some searching. And you can see each of the instruments has underneath of them the QA events that are associated with them, and then you can see those expected values that are associated with those QA events and the last time they were updated. So you could select one of those QA events with its associated expected value, and you can update it, set it to the new thing, and it keeps record of the last time they were changed. So you can kind of see a history of how they've changed, who's done the change. All right, QA event configuration. We were just talking about QA events in a way. We added an administrative screen to support this. So again, here's another user interface that makes it so you don't have to go to the database if you don't want to. If you're not familiar, yeah, as I mentioned, the QA events, you're associating if this digital tag is turned on, it means that this calibration sequence is in 0 phase or something like that. And so if you navigate to the QA event configuration, you would see kind of a similar user interface here where you can, all the same filtering options, searching options, you can see your different instruments, all the different QA events that are underneath of them, and then some pick lists for associating the cal request tags and the overload measurement tags, things like that. All right. Calibration sequences allow multiple non-device sequences to run simultaneously. So this, if you're not familiar with what I mean by non-device sequences, when Prism goes to start a calibration sequence, it kind of has two options. The first option is that, like with the 8864, it could download a calibration sequence to the logger. So you say, hey, logger 8864, I want you to do this, 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 and this. And just when I say start, just do it. That would be called a device calibration sequence, where the device is managing the sequence. Where Prism also supports non-device or Prism-driven sequences, where the Prism server says, all right, step 1, turn on this bit, monitor that thing. Step 2, turn on this bit, monitor that thing. So the Prism server is driving the sequence through all of its steps. It used to be that Prism could only execute one of those non-device driven sequences at a time. And so let's say you had a few different calibration sequences you all wanted to run in the morning, and they were sort of in independent areas, so they wouldn't affect each other. Well, Prisms, even though they were independent areas and wouldn't affect each other, Prism could still only do one at a time. That's been updated though. Now Prism can do multiples at a time, provided that they do not share IO points. In other words, you wouldn't want, if calibration sequence 1 used tag 5 and calibration sequence 2 also used tag 5 as the digital IO, you wouldn't want them to be able to run at the same time because they could create conflicts. All right. Replace in-app notification with better design. Replace flash animation with pop-up. What you'll see is you probably recognize this message, this little banner at the top, little flash thing. We just wanted to modernize that, and so we use this new message format here. You'll see the bottle successfully retired, and they can kind of stack if you have multiple things going on at a time, and you can X them out. And if you don't X out of those messages, they'll automatically disappear after 10 seconds. All right, data collector service. Overrange, underrange data behavior updates this is specifically for the 8864. So there was an issue where, well, let me back up a second. Let's say the 8864 is collecting data from an analog channel. It has 4 to 20 milliamps going into it, and it's recording that information. Well, if that 4 to 20 milliamp signal goes way high, like 20 should be the max, but for whatever reason it gets 40 milliamps, or maybe it gets negative 20 milliamps, which is completely outside the bounds. The 8864 responds by, if it's too high, it just it sets it with the O flag, and if it's too low, it sets it with the U flag. Now, Prism though before didn't use those flags, its behavior wasn't dependent on the O or the U flag. And so the request was made for Prism to start using those and to start doing the value substitution and flagging accordingly. So how it works, if Prism's monitoring one of these channels from the 8864 and it sees the O flag, it will set the source data, the raw data, to 25% above the scale range. So you can see like scale high minus scale low times a quarter plus scale high. And the same thing with the tag data. It will set it to 25% above the scale high, and it will assign it the overrange flag. Now, in a similar but not quite the same way, the U flag, the underrange flag For example, you somehow like put the 4 to 20 milliamp wires on backwards, so it was sending it, let's say -10, when it should have been sending +10. The source data will just get set, the raw data, the source data will get set to 25% below the range, just like how the O flag did, but in the opposite direction. But the tag data, this is where the difference is. The tag data will just be set to the scale low value. So the tag data will not go 25% below like everything else above or below. It'll just be set to scale low, and the tag will be assigned the under range flag. So that's a lot of words. What does this look like? On the left here, you can see an example of what the 8864 screen would look like with a few different flag conditions with an example value of 1.235. Well, in this situation, our scale low and our scale high are -10 and 10 respectively. So you'll see that, for example, if there's no flag, you just get a value of 1.2346. And the same thing in the tag data. The source data and the tag data, they're what you would expect. Now, if you get the O flag, you can see that the source data gets set to 15, which is 25% above that -10 to 10 range. And you see down below the tag value, same thing. With the U flag, which was the under range, you can see the source got set to 25% below, but the tag got set to just scale low. And just as a side note, the minus and plus flags, they don't have any bearing on how this data gets mapped. So here's a similar thing, just a different scale, same thing, except rather than -10 to 10, this is -100 to 100. And one last slide, I just wanted to make sure this was included, that if the scales are inverted, like for whatever reason, you have your scale high as -1000 and your scale low as 1000, the same logic applies with the U flag and the O flag. All right, qualifier service ability. We added the ability to time weight data. So there's two different interpretations out there about how to time weight data when you're building higher order averages, like your 1 hour average. One interpretation weights the constituent averages, uses the weighted constituent averages to build the higher order averages, and one does not. And one's not right or wrong, it's just different interpretations. And so we wanted to be able to support both. So how would you turn it on? Well, you would navigate admin, SEMS and site, application administration, switch to edit mode, select your qualifier service, which this was that UI we talked about earlier, and you would set your use sample weighted averaging to yes, and hit save, restart the qualifier service. I will note that we added this feature, but it's not default. The default going forward is still going to be how it was before. So adding this feature, unless you go in and change this setting, won't affect how your data is currently being processed. And same thing if you wanted to turn it off, which is default, this is what you would do. So a little bit of examples on what this looks like. On the top here, that's just some tag data. So let's just say for argument's sake that you just have 2 minutes of data at 3:05 and 3:20. You can see on the left side how it averages out to the 15-minute and then the hour is that when the sample weighting averaging is set to 0, it just takes an even average between 15 and 60. But on the right side, you can see that it does not take an even averaging of 15 and 16 because there was 2 samples on the 3:15 entry, and there was only 1 sample on the 3 o'clock entry. So it weighted the 60 twice as much as the 15. Here's another example you can see where there was a 0 kind of in the mix there. And I just wanted to include this just to make sure it was clear. This is an example of, the sample weighting is on and off just the same, except these data points were not sufficiently far apart. They didn't meet that 15-minute separation requirement. So that's why they ended up being marked out as 0. All right, 8864 source, a smarter time sync. There was an issue with Southern Company noted an issue where their calibration sequences were set to trigger right at a minute boundary. And what happened is that the 8864 was given the time sync update. In other words, Prism server said, hey, 8864, your time's a little off. This is what your time should be. Well, it sent that command to the 8864 right at that minute boundary, which effectively caused the 8864 to skip over that moment in time where it should have started the calibration sequence. So we added some smarts here to kind of keep that from happening in the future. So now it will only send time sync commands to the 8864 between the 11th and the 49th second of a minute. In other words, only the 50, 51, 52, 53, all the way to 7, 8, 9, 10. Those seconds, the 8864 could get a time sync command. But if it's near the minute boundary, it won't. Also, before it used to just kind of blindly send the time sync commands and just regularly send them. But now what we're doing is Prism server will ask the 8864 for its current time before sending the update. In other words, it'll say, hey, 8864, what's your time? And if the time that it thinks it is more than a second off from what the server thinks it is, the server will tell the 8864, here's your time. All right, data editor, trigger error when entering same constant values. Before, it wouldn't let you put in the same constant value, but now it'll just kind of give you a warning to say, hey, just a warning, you're putting in the same thing as last time. We added the bottle manager to the linearity module. As some of you might know, bottle manager is pretty important when you're running a linearity in CGA. So now you can, from the linearity module, access the bottle manager and do all the things that you would need to do to support a linearity test or CGA. Right. Fuel flow to load. There was a customer request to be able to explicitly specify the test numbers when you're running one of these things. And so before, the test number used to kind of be hidden in the background. It wasn't really it wasn't really exposed or editable, but now it is. And so if you're a facility that has your own test numbers for these things, we can support that. They just can't be duplicates for the same reporting group, I should say. All right, reporting. We added reporting notes for remaining tests. The request was to include the field reporting notes in remaining tests. The field was already included in the linearity and CGA tests. We wanted to also add it to NDFA, SIC, and sorbent traps. So what does that look like? Here's a screen grab of the NDFA. You can see we have some reporting notes. And that's what it would look like on the bottom if you were to add some. SIC module and sorbent trap. All right, reports module, DNS substitution. Some customer sites don't have DNS resolution, which prevents them from resolving server names. In other words, some places you don't have to type in 10.0.255.255. You would just type in server 1 or whatever your server name would be, and DNS resolution would know how to map that to the IP addresses. But some places don't support that, and we ran into issues where the reports, because of that, wouldn't run. There would be confusion about which of these addresses it's actually using. So now we upgraded it so that that does work. So here's an example. You can see for the server name, they actually put in the IP address directly, and you were still able to test and use the connection. And as expected, the report runs. All right, bug fixes. And like I mentioned, there's a bunch more bugs fixes in this. This is like half of them. So I really kind of trimmed down to the ones I thought was the most interesting. The first one, uninstalling Prism client and would uninstall Prism server. So this is a weird little one where during some of the installation processes, the Windows GUID, which is the ID number that Windows uses to kind of track applications, there ended up being a duplication for some reason. And so what would happen is because of that duplication, when you went to go uninstall one, it would also uninstall another, which it shared that GUID. So we dug into that, fixed it, shouldn't be an issue anymore. Bug fix, starting dashboard ID. As some of you might know, when you, with your SView file, your app, the thing you launch your application, there's an option in there where you can say, hey, when you launch the application, I want you to start on the dashboards page, and I want you to start on a specific dashboard. So this is useful for like maybe a control room view or something like that. And what we found was that it would launch the dashboard, but it wouldn't actually launch to the correct page within the dashboard. So that's been updated. Now it respects that as it should. All right, there was another bug that popped up, this random application error that was very difficult to isolate. It would just happen randomly, no rhyme or reason to what it would do. It would just, Prism main application be running for a good bit of time, nothing weird going on, and then all of a sudden you would get this application error. After a very extensive search, we were finally able to isolate this issue, and we actually fixed it because it's, application errors are pretty annoying. We actually fixed it in 1.6.2, 1.6.10, and this release going forward. All right, another one, first underscores were missing in text fields. This is just kind of a minor UI thing where if you had an underscore in, for example, your tag's name. So here I had tag underscore name underscore a number. In the database, it would have the underscores, it would all work just fine, but there was an issue where when the UI would display that string, those characters, it would omit the first underscore. So we went through a bunch of the UI stuff and fixed that in most of the places. All right, overview spark blinds, incorrect over time. In 1.6, there was an issue where sometimes the spark lines, as they would run over time, they would kind of clump up on the right side. And so in this example, this is just a sine wave that I had generated, and I just let it run for a while, and then you can see that sine wave kind of got clumped all the way up on the right. But in 1.6.2, 6.10, and the current release, we updated that so it kind of snakes along like you would expect. All right. Qualification reports only visible in preview mode. This is a minor little thing. The qualification reports admin screen, you had to be in preview features to be able to view it, but that was just a little mistake. It should have been super user mode to access those, not preview features. So that's been resolved. 8864 sequences didn't allow the user to specify affected channels. So previously, when you would create a calibration sequence on the 8864, and remember I'm talking about a device-driven sequence right now, Prism would had an algorithm by which it would assign the affected channels. And so if you're not familiar with what an affected channel is the channel on the data logger that's associated, channel or channels that's associated with that calibration sequence. So when that calibration sequence is running, that channel is marked such that it's known within the system that that channel is being affected by this calibration. And so, maybe downstream stuff would invalidate it. Basically, the system would know that the data being recorded by that channel is being affected by a calibration and it's not genuine emissions data. Now, it does that, but it also has the effect of if one calibration is running that has an affected channel, if there's another calibration that shares the same affected channel, the 8864 won't let you start it at the same time. Just like before when I was talking about how you don't want calibrations with the same digital I/O to be running at the same time, you don't want calibrations with the same affected channels to be running at the same time. So we added this new UI area here with the sequence editor for the 8864, where you can manually specify those affected channels if you need to. All right, another little bug fix, newly added sequence points, not updating in the UI. This is a pretty minor thing. It was if you went to add a point and you would do all the thing properly and you would hit OK and add, it would add it to the database, but when you looked at the UI, you wouldn't see the update right away. And so it could cause confusions thinking it didn't work, and so you would try again. But we updated it, so right away you add the point, you see the point, and you can avoid duplications. All right, muted alarm count does not change when alarm is muted. There was an issue where you would mute an alarm and the little in the bottom right corner there, that counter wouldn't update. So that's been fixed. Now the muted alarm count jives like you would expect. Yay, okay. And along a similar line, the silence alarm count, there was an issue causing that to be incorrect. So same idea, we've updated that. Navigation. So in the administrative screen, there's a back button. So you can navigate, go to this UI, go to this UI, you can hit the back button, but before, when you would hit the back button, it wouldn't actually return you to the same subcategory you were in. It would just return you back to the top of the administrative screen. So rather than when you hit back, it was the same thing as just going to the admin from the get-go, which is kind of frustrating for workflow purposes. So now when you hit the back button, it actually returns you to that subsection you were in. Okay. There's a problem with the DAS verification screen where sometimes you would navigate to it and the files would be missing. So we fixed that in 1.6.2, 1.6.10, and 1.7. And there was also, probably most people haven't seen this, but there was a weird issue that if you navigated to and from the DAS verification screen in just such an order, you would sometimes get this application error, and so that's been resolved as well. Source administration. It used to be that when you would navigate to source configuration, it would have to load a lot of stuff in the background and it was kind of slow. And so effort was made to optimize how this works. So now when you navigate to source administration, it's much faster. It all loads right away. You can toggle through everything pretty quick. Just a much better user experience. All right. Continue along with source stuff. The Modbus ID was not retained for Modbus IO sources. So the issue was you would set your Modbus ID there when you were configuring the source, and then somewhere along the way it would actually get dropped. So that's been fixed. The Modbus ID retains its value as expected. All right, bug fix. Save file when source name is too long. Basically, when you went to add a new source, if you put in a source name that was too long and you hit create, it would just give you an error. And so we, as mentioned in one of the other features, we improved the validation where it won't let you put in a name that's too long. It won't let you it won't let you put in invalid stuff as you create the source. Editing raw points, scaling crash DCS. In 1.6, there's an issue where sometimes if you change the scaling of a raw point, you couldn't set the value properly, and you couldn't restart the DCS, and it was just because of the SQLite cache in the background, which it wasn't a big deal. You could just delete the cache, but that's really inconvenient to have to do that. So now, as of 1.6.1 and this release, the DCS, if you change the scaling, it'll restart as expected. It automatically takes care of that caching issue. All right. I think I got through with a little bit of time to spare for questions.
All righty, we have about 5 questions. So the first one is, will 1.7 also support creating XML files for ECMPS submittal, just in case the ECMPS 2.0 requirement is delayed?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I don't know when we're gonna stop supporting the XML, but we're definitely not gonna stop supporting it until it's for sure not needed.
Okay. What are the database permissions required to add a new raw point?
I think I think if you're able to do any of the administrative stuff with the Prism user interface, you should be able to add the raw point as well. I don't know, maybe one of the other developers has some more information to say on that.
Yeah, I think that's right, Doug. You should be able to, as long as you can delete data from rows, you should be able to do that with a raw point. I would think.
All right. If an existing raw point is renamed, do the associated calculations dependent on that point to that new name?
Yes, and the reason for that is that it's associated with the ID, not necessarily the name. So you can change the name all day, but the IDs are still what they should be.
Are there any 8864 firmware requirements for the AI override?
No, it just has to. Yeah, I'm pretty sure any 8864 out in the field right now should support that. The A-type channel and the logger has been around for quite a long time, and and that feature's always been part of it. So no, I think any 8864 you have out there should work for that.
Can any user cold start the 8864?
I think right now it's just wrapped in the preview feature. Landon, did we have thoughts on how that's going to be managed as far as administration permissions in the future?
Yeah, you just have to have source administration type permissions, obviously, to get to that page. And then, yeah, Doug's right, it is wrapped in the preview feature, checkbox for now. So yeah, any comments or feedback on that, we'll definitely take that into account before it goes live.
Maybe the confirm could actually be like a password entry or something.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, that was all of our questions. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Douglas.